What is the thing that reminds us most about our early Hema days? For me, it was the day when I started teaching other people Longsword. And that's exactly what I've been doing the last 6 months. I started with 12 students and I ran my first beginner course in Longsword. And it reminded me that everything I learned and everything I can do now took countless hours to get me to where I am today. And that I have long been taking a lot of it for granted. And now it hits me once again. Being a beginner isn't anything but easy. But this time though, I was on the other side. And not only did I have a whole bunch of beginners to train, I also had to make sure that while the 6 months, they could do as much as possible so they could then be brought into regular training. That is not a small task. And from the lessons plan I wrote at the start, there isn't much left today. So today I want to talk about 5 learnings I took away from these 6 months. And the ones I will use to give my next beginners an even better training. First, less is more. As someone who likes to use Lichtenauer as a base for his fencing, I built my lessons around the core ideas of the Lichtenauer school. Most people will immediately think about the 4-leger and the 5 master strikes, which are considered the defined basis of the Lichtenauer tradition, and those are exactly what I took for my course. And I structured all my 8 sessions with my beginners so I can cover all of them. But even while writing the course, I realized I had to draw an distinction. Is it important that my students heard every technique there is, or that they actually can apply it? In the end, I decided to teach only what my students really need. That meant things like the Scheitelhau or the Alba simply got dropped because they would have blown the scope of the course. Today I know I even have to cut another 50% of what I already did. But first, to understand what I mean by less is more, let me give you a few examples from my practice to give you a little insight into my experience. The very first example was actually quite early on in the courses, when I explained how to grip a sword. I show all sorts of variations, from the handshake grip to the thumb grip to the hammer grip, and basically everything I've seen fencers do over the years. And that exactly where the first mistake was. In my experience, variation and options are mostly just confusing. Out of the well-meant intention of letting people try what works for them, I ended up with the wildest interpretation of everything I showed. The results was I had to correct my students handling a sword right up until the end of the course. The lesson for the next session: stick with one grip until techniques actually call for a different one. In other words, there's only one way to hold the sword. On top of that, I noticed that the size of a person's hands can also play an important role, how they hold the sword. And when I leave any rooms, students grip the sword in whatever way is comfortable for them, not in the way they need in order to execute techniques efficiently. For the second thing, showing things my students don't need for the following drills is a waste of oxygen and time. You think maybe a few things will stick and that you are building on understanding of other elements of the drill, but in reality, most of them forget what I said before we even start the drill. Not because they lack the ability to understand it, but simply because with new material, the only thing that sticks is what actually gets done. As a coach, you then sometimes have to remind yourself that it took me 2 years just to know all these things. And that's before we even talk about being able to apply them. For the third thing, fundamentals over fancy techniques. I myself have been saying for years that there are really only 5 things all cuts are made of: an Oberhau, Unterhau, long edge cut, false edge cut, and a frost. But for some reason I threw that wisdom straight out the window when I wrote my lesson plan. Because what I mean by these 5 things is that the vast majority of what we do in tournaments or sparring or in fencing in general are basic cuts. Simple strikes I can combine in all kinds of variations. And it's exactly these simple strikes that are so much more important than any fancy guard or technique like Zornhaar or a Schielhaar, for example. I've learned that when these basics are solid first, students find the master strikes easier to do. So in other words, I'd rather not train any master strikes at all than taking training time away from the basics. Which brings me straight to my next point. Repetition over detailed monologues. Repetition is and remains the most important part of any training. What holds true for advanced fencers holds also true for beginners, just as much in Hema as for all other instructions there are. A lot of instructors tend to launch into endless monologues about why technique matters, where it comes from and how it fits into the whole system. I have often caught myself going into too much detail and demonstrating techniques that are correct in theory but play very little part in actual fencing. One important factor here, as a Hema instructor, you often feel you have to win people over to get them excited. But that's only true to a certain point. As much as we love to nerd about sword techniques, there are no need to put on a show-off and lay out a perfect chain of arguments just to convince absolutely everyone that what you are showing is right. I have had far better results explaining the techniques or drill in short, easy to understand words, and then simply letting the beginners have a go and do the drill. It is impossible to explain a drill in a way that all the people actually know what they have to do. There's still one person in the room that didn't get it. And you know what? That's completely normal. Let me explain why I think that's the case. When I think about my school time, I spent hours listening to teachers and paying attention in class. But when it came to actually doing the stuff myself, I made mistakes, of course. Or I even had to look up the whole chapter again. The same principle that already applied in school applies here too. You only really learn when you do it. I can hold a 30-minute monologue and go into details for every technique, but the moment it comes to applying it, it is sometimes that you actually never spoke a word at all. My takeaway for this: explain the drill, then stand next to each student during the process and keep correcting them until it works once. I've learned that once students have a moment of success in a drill, that contributes far more to them actually learning something than any monologue have ever given. Also falling under this point, rather than having a lot of variations in a drill, keep the variation low and run the drill for longer, with several breaks in it. As I said, less is often more, because you can engage with one single thing for longer and more intensely. What brings me to my next point. Give them a fencing background and give them a context. Of course, it doesn't work entirely without a context and fencing theory. But you may ask, without monologues, there are basically no fencing theory. So when is the perfect moment to present historical context and fencing theory? What I have found is that the fresher the trainees are, the less open they are to theoretical approaches. Why is that? Most of my beginners who come to me have jobs or are students. In Central Europe, where I'm living, most of us are working job where you sit around all day or discuss theoretical concepts in meetings all day. So if I'm the 12th person that day to talk their ear off with theory, context and history, not much is going to stick. So how do I approach them? So first I give them drills and get them sweating, and then they're kind of done and take, for example, a quick water break. And that's the perfect moment to feed them some fencing theory. But the next question is, what is really worth knowing? So here's my learning from the last 6 months. Theory has to help students ask the right question. So with every piece of theory, ask yourself 2 questions. Is the theory relevant enough that it could matter for your beginner in the near future? And does it support the understanding of the current drill? That means everything I provide in terms of context should be tailored to the current training day. There's no point in providing context for a technique that isn't on the agenda today. Let me give you an example. In one of my sessions where I worked through the shield how with my students, I made the mistake of demonstrating the shield how as a thrust. Now you might be asking, yeah, but the shield how is also a thrust, so there's nothing wrong. And you're absolutely right. It's just in the drill that followed, I wanted the shield how to be executed purely as a cut. But because I provided context that matters for the technique as a whole, yet it didn't feel the drill. Because the consequences now was, every time the strike felt short and was therefore wrong, my students promptly turned it into a thrust. And there was it again. I walked around correcting every single one of them, and they did something that I was told them to do, but they misread the context. So they end up with drilling the drill in the wrong way and not even noticing it. So my approach for the future will be, if you want thing A, then show only the context for thing A and leave B, C and D out of it. But I want to stay a little bit more of the context and tell you my fourth learning. And that is, show them how the play actually works. The mother of all context is, of course, sparring and how the technique actually plays out in the fight. And this is actually only possible if you give them the possibility to have some practice hours. Because I run my beginner course with steel swords, but without a mask and without gloves. That means a lot of what I demonstrate only works in a very controlled way. And this is opening up a problem. The practice side comes up a little bit short, and the students usually don't know how to deal with power and momentum, because that is what I take out of the drill for obviously safety reasons. But it doesn't have to be that way. I've learned that you can give everything you demonstrate an realistic context really easily by demonstrating things yourself on one hand and letting the trainees try them out on the other hand. For the first thing, I grabbed my co-instructor and demonstrated all the techniques on him at full speed. That let me give my beginners a good feeling for what it means to make cuts with commitment, and there is no need to be afraid when something goes wrong. And the other way to do it is to put on full kit and let my beginners test the techniques on me. This not only gives them a feeling on how to apply certain techniques, they also actively learn to overcome the hesitation of hitting people with steel swords. You can hardly give beginners better feedback than putting on gear and get beaten up by your beginners. And my last learning I want to mention is that the best way to improve commitment in your cuts is practice it in a safe environment. And this is mainly possible with foam swords. When I wrote the lesson plan, I fixed 10 minutes of sparring with foam swords into every session, because I believe it is important to put what you have learned into practice as early as possible. And even though foam swords don't really resemble steel, they are still a good compromise, and for everything I teach, I can really recommend them. But my real learning came when I increasingly starting to use foam swords not only for sparring, but to run entire drills with them. That turned out to be one of the best decisions, and it let my beginners run the drill with speed every time. And it gave me the option to run the drills at all sorts of intensity. A small learning, but definitely a tool that is here to stay for my beginner training. But not everything I did or I thought I did was actually wrong. So to end this up, I want to share with you some examples of things I would definitely do again. Writing a lesson plan for a course is absolutely worth it. And not only can you plan and structure your training in advance so that on the day you only have to teach and don't think about it, you also have a documentation of everything you did in the course. That is the only way to look back over the course and review what you actually did and where you can improve. It also meant I could hand entire sessions over to another instructors without worrying that they would do completely different things that goes in different directions. The second thing I would do again is footwork as a fixed part of a warm-up. At the start of every training, there was a repetition of all 4 footwork types. A basic step, a passing step, a flash, and a lunge. Over the month, that made the movements steadily better and more fluent. Fencers who used to have trouble and tripping over their own feet could in the end not only tell the footwork types apart, but also apply them in drills. So that's definitely something that will also stay. And for the last point, feel free to be picky when it comes to structure and technique, and take as much time as it takes until the trainee has done it right for at least one time. And then celebrate the success with them, so he or she can be proud of themselves that they did something right and they have a moment of success. I was never a big fan of coaches who try to see in everything some sort of improvement or are too positive about something that is actually wrong and could lead to bad habits. The reason people or coaches often do this to prevent that students are quitting or getting frustrated too soon or too early on, and then start quitting the course. What I often see ending up in praising half wrong or half right versions just so the trainee doesn't throw the towel or quit the course. I think beginners are more resilient than we might often think, and you're allowed to correct them 30 times and go through it all again with them if it's needed. Beginners have to earn their coach's praises too. And over these 6 months, I noticed that the way I gave feedback and supported people really paid off in the end. So to wrap this up, I would love to hear what your experience with beginners have been. So write me a comment down below, and I hopefully see you in the next video.